session of Irish History from the Hedgerow at the Irish Roots Cafe, produced by IrishRoots.com with Peter Reilly Adams and Michael O'Loughlin. Find a spot on the warm, sunny side of the hedgerow now. Today's session is about to begin. They were rough, unpolished men, brilliant scholars, teaching by the side of the road, in small rooms, in nooks and crannies, wherever and whenever possible. Such men as these, they were the teachers of the hedge.
Today, we're going to discuss the entire issue of the Irish famine on Gorta Moor, the Great Hunger, the Potato Famine, the blight of the 1800s in Ireland. It has had a tremendous impact on Irish thinking, on how people have even thought about Ireland. Ireland are known as those great potato eaters. What was it about the potato? It which brought them so much happiness and brought them so much pain. So today, myself, Peter Adams, along with Michael O'Loughlin, we will be discussing this. We will discuss it from a standpoint of, what was it like in Ireland before? Was this the first time Ireland had encountered such disaster? What did it do to the Irish, and from where did we come after that? Michael.
Peter, thanks a lot for that introduction. I'm excited to get started on this because this is one topic that everybody can relate to. And as I look back through history, you see things that affected the Irish culture, like the flight of the Earls back around 1609 or so, the Treaty of Limerick in 1691, and that really just tore the Irish culture apart. And here's another thing that happened much more recent to us and really in great-grandparents' memories, which is the famine, and it tore the culture of Ireland apart just as well. We can talk about that towards the end, but now let's talk a little bit. What do you think about exactly how and when the famine started?
Excellent. The interesting thing about the famine, which most people don't know, or not so much the famine, when we make that reference, we're talking about the mid-1800s. But what about the failure of crops to enable them, homegrown, to feed the populace? Failures of crops had happened, or famine, which is a distinct definition of the failure of food, had occurred many times in Ireland. Actually, there had been some in the 1200s. As we look then with British rule and what had happened for Ireland then, from 1728 up until 1845, the failure of potato had been 24 times, but it wasn't always the same cause. Things changed that with the potato, with the conditions of the land, with the work of the people, all those things had an impact on why the products weren't being produced properly. What was the one in 1845, the Phytophthora infestans, the blight, a fungus? And what's the other, Michael, that as a part of that fungus?
That's right. I had always heard that it was a fungus, and I've seen formal papers presented on it as a fungus. But now I'm seeing reports comes out, and they say, well, actually, it's like a oomycete.
Yes,
is the best I can pronounce it. And there's several stories about where that came from and how it arrived in Ireland. But one thing is, they all seem to say it came from either North America or South America. And I guess the one I most recently heard was that it came from the Mexican Central Highlands, and by 1843 it had gone into Philadelphia and New York, and some people say bad seed potatoes were sent to Belgium farmers in 1845, and other people say it was used on the clipper ships to feed the crews. What do you think?
Well, there's no doubt that there was actually a blight in eastern United States between 1843 and 1844. Now, there had been shipping between the two countries. There was commerce going on. What was on the ships? We know that diseases came on ships. When the rats would bring the fleas, and the fleas would become on the land, and the rats onto the land, and people who had not been immunized in a sense, even in their own growth or in any other way, were open to this kind of disease and kind of problems. Well, the same thing happened with the vegetation. Where did it come from? Yes, some say it came out of South America and Peru, as you've said. Others say it came from the Americas on the potatoes, with the potatoes that came to Ireland. And this blight didn't only affect Ireland. Again, it did affect Belgium, it affected Holland, it affected northern France, and it affected southern England. That brings us to a very old, disturbing idea. Well, if it went to all those other places, how come the disaster was so terrible in Ireland, and in the other places that had the same blight, it didn't destroy the people, and it didn't bring about so many deaths, and then the change of everything that was for the country of Ireland, for the land of Ireland?
Well, that's right. Why was this famine different than all the others that the Irish did survive? And, of course, one answer to that is that the plots were becoming subdivided, and people became dependent more and more each year on the potato to support them. And this famine actually hit repeatedly, and it was disastrous several years between 1845 and 1849, although by 49 things were starting to look better just for the potatoes. But, you know, you still had the cholera and the disease that was actually really ended up killing more of the Irish than the actual starvation, which weakened them and gave rise to all the disease in the first place.
I know that in McManus, The Story of the Irish Race, he said that the terrible famine of 47 and 48 proved to be the most stunning blow that the Irish nation received in a century. It was something that was far more... I've often found it almost enjoyable when they said it was the worst in 46 and it was even worse in 47. Well, if it was the worst, how can it be even worse than the worst? A use of the language. But they didn't know what it was. The English... And we have to go to what their response was. But it said that they were sending someone over. They sent scientists to Ireland to, as it said, the English said, to study the problem. What they came back with was they didn't know what it was. They had absolutely no idea. So their response wasn't on how we're going to get rid of this famine or get rid of this blight on the potato. It's how are we going to deal with the problem so it does not have a great impact on England, on the entire United Kingdom.
Well, that's right. Politics played a large part of the problem there. I guess Peel was actually in charge of things there in the beginning, and he
was the prime minister, yes, and of the Tory party, the Conservative Party.
That's right, and he actually set aside 100,000 pounds worth of Indian meal when he saw the famine coming, but they didn't think it was going to be as bad as it came out to be, which was part of the problem. And that first year in 1845, they had already harvested about 1/6 of the crop before it struck, so they didn't think it was going to be as bad as what happened, and no one died of simple starvation, several people have said, in 1845 or 1846. It was 1847 when things really started to come to a head.
Absolutely. And, you know, you talk about the money that was made available in order to take care of it. At the same time, when they voted 100,000 pounds for relief for the starving of 2 million people, as they saw it at the time, they also voted for 200,000 pounds to beautify one of the gardens in the parks.
Yes, and statues. Statues were renovated with tremendous expense.
The statue in Dublin.
Yes. But, you know, when that Whig Party came in, that's when
Lord
we had...
Nelson.
Yeah, Nelson. When
My mind just disappeared.
Yeah, you know, that happens, doesn't it?
Part of the real problem is what was the response, along with what was the expectation of the Irish on their farms. Remember that so many, because of Catholics, there was also oppression of the Catholics, and the Catholics weren't allowed to own so much land, no more than 2 acres. If they died, the owner of the farm died, and they had Catholic children, it had to be split up between all of the children. Unless, of course, the oldest son was to convert to Protestantism, then the entire farm went to him. What we have is that the Irish were given smaller and smaller pieces of land in which to survive. If they rented that land, they had to use the land to provide for themselves. Then they had to use other parts of the land to produce other products that would help them pay the rent for the land. Well, what happened during the hunger is that the potatoes failed. So then they would eat the other vegetables, this is in the beginning, eat the other vegetables in order to survive, but then they didn't have the extra crops to help pay their rent. Then they were removed from their land, and this caused an even greater hardship on them. They were losing their ability to feed themselves, and they were losing their homes, the very places in which they were able to survive.
Well, that's right. And you can read, there was one story in The Great Hunger by Cecil Woodham Smith, and she talked about a Mrs. Gerard of Baltinglass, County Galway. And during the famine era, she had 300 tenants evicted with the help of the troops and the police in the area. And she had a court order stating that it was to become grazing lands, and it was common just to knock in the roofs of those homes, and you might spend one more that night maybe in that home if you had lived there, and you were out on the streets after that. And you just might look, and people would look in later years and say, well, where are the animals, and where are the people, and what are all these empty shells doing there that we can still see today?
Absolutely, because we all know that the Irish don't tear too many things down. There's still a lot of rock houses and things throughout the land. In fact, as you travel through Ireland, you'll find that the modern houses, they're built next door, right on the same plot. They're built next to the old buildings, and they're kept there. One has to remember, though, in 1800, Ireland was called by Gladstone in England the greatest number of people in all of Europe on the size of the land. They had 8 million people. Now, between that for the next 50 years, they lost half of that. In some things you say the population, it was halved. How many died of starvation? Starvation wasn't the only thing that killed them. Disease, because they were losing their homes, because they were being pushed into other places, workhouses and other things, they also found themselves being exposed to other dangers. Typhoid was rampant. Diarrhea was rampant. Yes, the hunger's there. All of this stuff, and then they shared it with each other, sadly, we can say. 1.3 million people is statistically said died. But there are places in the people dying on the roads. They weren't counted. They found people laying on the road with the green juice of grass coming out of the side of their mouths. They were just then put into a grave. There were mass graves. There are mass graves all over Ireland. In one particular point, they were doing some excavating to build a road, and then they discovered bones and skulls, and they found a grave of 153 people when they were doing some road works in order to improve things. People had no place to go, and all of those numbers weren't counted. We can estimate if we lost 4 million, they just changed the numbers and say, well, then so many emigrated. They can't even say that's exact, because there were many smaller ships that also left Ireland, going somewhere else to get away from the tragedies that were occurring. Many, yes, of course, came to America. Others, we don't know where they went. And more of the records would also say if you broke the law, you would be given transportation. In fact, there was a law passed, the coercion laws, and it was passed that an Irishman could not be out of his house from sunset to sunrise. Well, when you didn't have a house, it wasn't easy to be inside of your house in order not to be caught. Well, some of the people even broke the law. They said some people even stole so that they would be given a sentence of transportation to get away from the great troubles, the great hunger that was going on in the nation. And that caused another flight of people away. But, of course, how many died on the way? Those are the ones that have been referred to as coffin ships. And so we don't know, actually. We know we lost 4 million people. The exact numbers is to be left in history.
Well, you know, they've got some studies on the immigration into Quebec in 1847, and the death rates on board, on average, were 18%. And one ship, it's documented, they had a 44% mortality. And, of course, 47 was a bad year. But with things like that, you might have thought a whole shipload of people would arrive when they left Ireland. They'd arrive fine, but they didn't. The trip over was just as hazardous as staying back home. And one other comment on the, they set up those workhouses and the poor law unions to support the mass populace as they were starving to death. And sometimes you mentioned people wanted to get into the penal colony so they'd be shipped away perhaps to Australia. Well, you know what? There was the Earl Grey scheme that was connected to Australia, and that's where 4,000 adolescent female orphans from the ages of 14 to 20 actually signed up and applied and passed a little cursory examination so they could be shipped to Australia. And that was really to save their lives. And 1/4 of those girls had one parent living in Ireland, but they could not support them. And it was an act of mercy to send those children away. And that made really a little bit of a different kind of impact on Australia.
There's also, when you talk about they couldn't support them or whether, before these events, the Irish married young. And we know that everybody says, oh, you're Irish, you're not married, because the Irish men always wait to get married. That is actually a result of the hunger, because they didn't want to bring any more children into the world because they couldn't feed them. Yet before, and one of the archbishops was quoted as saying that, why did the Irish marry young? Well, because of all the other poverty and the other problems, they at least could give comfort to one another. But when the famine hit, then the practice of marrying young started to cease. And then, of course, it carried on into the next, because there was so much immigration. So people didn't want to stabilize because they didn't know what destabilization would happen to them. You mentioned the notion of what happened with Quebec. It's also known, they said, some 90,000 of immigrants to Canada in 47. It recorded that 6,100 died on the voyage. 4,100 died on arrival, and 5,000 died in hospitals. And then soon 1,900 or so died in towns to which they had gone. The ships that came, the Larch, it carried 440 passengers, had 108 deaths. The Queen, carrying 493 passengers, had 137 deaths. The Virginis, carrying 476 passengers, had 267 deaths. People died on the ships. They died because of the conditions, and there's some that say that some of the ships that were brought out, the English brought ships that had not been in use. They brought them, put them there, and started moving people, and it cost £6 for a family of 4 to leave Ireland by ship. What were they making? Some of them were making 10 pence a day, working the entire day.
Boy, I tell you, that is a story. And Grosse Isle or Grosse Isle, I think they call it in Canada, on that St. Lawrence Seaway.
Yes, St. Lawrence.
That was an island that was set aside just to handle these, really the famine immigrants then. And the stories are horrendous. And there was some heroic people that worked to help the Irish there. And they're very active even to this day. I think they just put up another Famine Memorial just in the last decade or so, maybe less than that. And one of the older memorials that was sitting there said, in this secluded spot lie the mortal remains of 5,294 persons who, flying from pestilence and famine in Ireland in the year 1847, found in America but a grave.
There is also in Ireland the Ancient Order of Hibernians, a Irish organization founded in the 1800s in New York, along with organizations in Ireland, put up a memorial. It's 2 large steel doors, and it's reminiscent of the workhouses. And it shows a young boy knocking on the door, asking to come in for some food, but his family had died. And it gives a message on the doors about what it was that was occurring in the years of the famine. And it is said that across that road, right where this memorial is where maybe 5,000 people are buried in mass graves. And to stand there, it gives you a very eerie feeling. So the notion of the famine is something that happened 150 years ago. The reality is that though it did happen that many years ago, it is still in the minds of the people that starvation occurred. And not only the starvation, but at times, and it is even suggested that it was in fact a genocide by the British government, because the Irish, they did not see them to be worth anything, and most of the things that were done in order to help Ireland at that time were done to protect the gentry, not the peasants. They wanted to make the others survive, and some members of Parliament and others said, well, the Irish ought to be aware what God is doing to them to save them from their wretchedness.
Well, I tell you what, and where did all these people go that survived? By 1850, the potato disease was on the wane and they could see a recovery coming. But by that time, there were already more Irish in New York City than in Dublin City. And by 1851, 1/4 of Liverpool in England was Irish and 1/3 of Toronto was Irish. And the story just keeps going on. And what do we have? 1/4 of the population in Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, another source says, was Irish, and 80% of the Irish settled in those areas.
That's right. The word is also used when it makes reference to the Jews, but the diaspora, the dispersion of a people from their homeland to all sorts of places in the earth. And look how far the Irish have come in this world and what we have done to inspire the world in a sense. There's a tremendous impact, but the Irish bring along with them the suffering that they had. You cannot forget what we went through before we became accomplished, and that suffering, which was over and over, and for so many reasons. The famine is one of the things that occurred. When we talked about they asked her, what is this thing? And it's the fungus or what. They believed some, and because remember, the Industrial Revolution had just begun in Europe at the end of the 18th century. So you have here into the 19th century and things being developed. Some thought these new locomotives, the smoke was doing it. That was what the problem was. Others thought it was something under the ground, maybe volcanoes that we didn't know were there. And others thought that, it was the lightning from the storms. And then, of course, we have said some thought it was from the manure that was brought over. It came in the manure that was sent from Latin America, which was widely used in northern Europe. Also, when they talk about it being the railroad, in 1846, the Great Southern Railroad developed in a new line from Dublin to Carlow. And another thing that needs to be understood is that in 1847, it is the winter on record, the worst in Irish history. Not only did they have no food, and then they were removed from their homes because of not being able to pay the rent, because they couldn't grow the crops in order to pay the rent to the tenants, for the tenants to the landowners, who most of the time were in England. They were out in the cold and they froze to death. There's another part of what happened in those years, disastrous years. History was playing a bad hand.
Well, you know what? And there's so many other things that were lost as a result of the famine. People don't think of it very much, but even though they went through all these tribulations for so long, they still had 4 million Irish language speakers in the country before the famine. And after the famine, that's reduced to less than 1 million, and most of those were older, and so they didn't carry on the tradition, and we're feeling that to this day, where there's just a few areas in the Gaeltacht where you might be able to go and get the feeling of what Ireland was like before the famine, because the people still had that language alive in them.
And when you talk about into the Gaeltacht, traveling in Ireland, go to the Gaeltacht, and you'll discover that in places in Donegal, in Galway, and in Mayo, which are most noted as Gaeltacht areas, though there are others in other counties, the rocks and the land is not as fine as it is in other places in Ireland, like, for instance, in the Midlands. And they suffered much greater as the famine was, or the fungus was dying away itself, and the potato was rejuvenating itself in those lands in Donegal and Mayo and Galway out, it was not coming as quickly, and so they weren't as able to recover, and their suffering lasted much, much longer.
Well, that's right. And they say that areas like Belfast, it was more of a public health hazard with the living in the tenement-type areas, but they had enough of an economy and enough industry, and probably the only area that had really the industry, and that helped them survive the famine years much better than the rest of the country.
Well, Belfast was industrialized much more than other parts of the country because it had been taken over, in a sense, by the Protestant ascendancy, and that's what England was concentrating on, making sure that that would develop. Some said that the Queen, Victoria at the time, was so nice because she was going to send something for him, that the Queen said, "It is our duty to consider whether any measure can be devised calculated to give peace and protection for life there." She wasn't talking about the peasants, she was talking about the gentry, those who owned the land, and the English, who, yes, in some way became Irish. She was trying to protect them, and they were not talking about the other, and Belfast, of course, was the center of that. And that helped cause, when you talk about the Gaeltacht and where it was, and the knowing of the Irish, that helped the famine, in a sense, help stir on another feeling of nationalism and pushed over into a revival of Gaelic language and of Gaelic music and of poetry, and which will also be a topic of which we will cover in one of our future sessions.
The idea of an Irish nation or a Celtic nation in a background, which some people really tried to say, no, that's not really true. But you know what? These new DNA tests they've been doing just in the past 5 or 6 years are showing that the Irish really do have a common Celtic heritage. And the Sea Peoples, although they were there, and the Vikings, although they were there, they're not as populous as we once thought in the bloodline of the Irish.
Certainly. The Irish have maintained themselves, and it's that gave us strength.
Well, you know what? I think we're coming to the end of this first session. We've gone through 26 minutes already of just our talk, so there's no end to what we can do, but this is just part one. We may have to continue this at a later date, but Peter, I want to say this is great, and I've enjoyed this first kickoff of our new endeavor here, and I think we're going to be able to cover a lot of areas of Irish history, and I think we welcome any comments from anybody out there listening in the audience that can add something to our discussion or even suggest a topic. So that's it for me, Peter. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Michael. I think this is going to be a great endeavor. And what we want to do is we want to share our knowledge and pursue a greater knowledge of ourselves and for you of the Irish and Irish history.
So ends this chapter of Irish History from the Hedgerow. The entire series is available at www.irishroots.com. We have broadcast series on genealogy, song, local history, as well as original publications for every county in Ireland. The Hedge School in Ireland was totally reliant upon the local community to survive, just as we are here today in our modern-day Hedge School. If you believe in what we are doing for your community, please do send us your support. You can sponsor a session of Irish Hedgerow history for as little as $100 and become a recognized scholar of the Hedge. You will also receive a pass or letter of introduction from the instructors here at the school, as was the custom of the Hedgerow. So keep the Hedge growing with your donation, subscription, or membership. Thank you. We have been available for speaking engagements, exhibits, tours, and educational events since 1984. You can reach us at the Irish Roots Cafe on Twitter and Facebook, and on our homepage at www.irishroots.com, by mail at our U.S. location, the Irish Roots Cafe, Box 7575, Kansas City, Missouri 64116. Leave a message on our phone recorder at 816-256-3360. Copyright 2009.